the crime scene that told its own story. When detectives arrived that night, they expected another routine call, a possible burglary gone wrong. But as the flashlights swept across the small, tidy home at the end of Willow Creek Drive, they realized something unsettling. The scene didn't just hold evidence, it was telling a story. And if anyone listened closely enough, it was screaming the truth. Willow Creek was the kind of neighborhood people described as quiet, not the kind of quiet that feels eerie or lifeless, but the kind that wraps itself around you like a familiar blanket. The streets were lined with tall oak trees whose branches touched above the road, forming a leafy tunnel that glowed gold in the evening sun. Neighbors waved at each other from their porches, children rode bikes in the cul-de-sac, and the mailman knew everyone's name. It was a place where people trusted each other, where car doors were left unlocked, and where the loudest sounds on a Sunday afternoon were sprinklers and laughter. Among those picture-perfect homes sat a modest white house with blue shutters in a small garden that always seemed to bloom brighter than the rest. That was Emma Hayes' home. At 32, she had become something of a local favorite, the kind of person who always smiled, always remembered birthdays, and always stayed late after school to help a struggling student. She was the elementary school's art teacher, known for her creativity, patience, and the way she could turn even the simplest project into something special. The children adored her, parents trusted her, and her colleagues admired her calm, graceful nature. Emma's life seemed beautiful on the surface, an orderly routine of lesson plans, evening walks, and quiet nights with her cat, Milo. But as with many lives that appear peaceful, there was another story beneath it. Just 6 months earlier, she had separated from her husband, Daniel Hayes. The two had met in college, fallen in love quickly, and married right after graduation. At first, everything seemed perfect. Daniel was charming, ambitious, a construction foreman who prided himself on hard work. But over the years, their marriage had changed. Arguments began to fill the spaces where laughter used to live. They fought about small things, bills, time, promises broken and forgotten. Friends described Emma as someone who tried to make things work for far too long. She believed people could change, that patience could heal, that love could weather distance and disappointment. But Daniel grew restless. He spent more nights away, came home later, spoke less. Eventually, he packed a bag and left, saying he needed space. That was the word he used, space. Emma never asked what that meant. She just nodded, holding back tears, and watched him walk out of the house they had built together. In the months that followed, Emma tried to move forward. She filled her days with work and surrounded herself with people who cared for her. Her best friend, Maya Torres, was a constant presence, the kind of friend who always knew when Emma was struggling, always ready with a bottle of wine and an open ear. Maya had been in Emma's life for over a decade. They had met during a teacher's conference and bonded instantly. To everyone else, they were inseparable. To Emma, Maya was family. Those who knew Emma say she never stopped hoping her life would find its balance again. Even after the separation, she kept her wedding ring in a small wooden box by her bedside. Not because she wanted Daniel back, but because it reminded her of who she had once been and who she still wanted to be, hopeful, kind, forgiving. Yet beneath her calm demeanor, Emma carried something heavy. There were days when she seemed distracted at school, her eyes wandering out the window during class. She would catch herself, smile, and go back to painting with the children. But that shadow in her expression, the one that flickered across her face for just a moment, told a different story. A few of her colleagues had quietly wondered if she was being followed. Emma had mentioned seeing a car parked across the street at odd hours. Once she even said she heard footsteps outside her window late at night, but she always laughed it off. "It's just my imagination," she'd say. "Willow Creek is safe." On March 7th, a day before everything changed, Emma stayed late at school. There had been an art fair coming up, and she wanted to finish hanging her students' drawings. She was one of those teachers who did everything herself. She didn't want the janitor or another staff member to help. They deserved to have their art displayed perfectly, she told the principal before leaving. That evening, Maya stopped by to drop off dinner. She said Emma had seemed a little tense, maybe even frightened. When asked why, Emma had hesitated before saying something strange. "I think someone's been in the house," she whispered. Maya asked if she had proof. Emma shook her head. "Just small things," she said. "A picture frame turned the wrong way. A drawer left open. My cat acting nervous." Maya told her she was probably just overthinking things, that stress could make the smallest details feel like warning signs. But Emma wasn't convinced. That night, she locked her doors, checked her windows twice, and left a light on in the hallway. The next morning, she didn't show up for work. That was unusual. Emma had never missed a day without notice. When the principal called her phone, it went straight to voicemail. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chambers, noticed that Emma's car was still in the driveway, the same spot it had been parked in the night before. By noon, her coworkers were worried. At around 2 p.m., her colleague and close friend, a teacher named Sarah Collins, decided to drive over to check on her. The neighborhood was unusually quiet that afternoon, no children playing, no sound of mowers. When Sarah reached the front door, she noticed it wasn't fully closed. It was slightly ajar, like someone had left in a hurry. She called out Emma's name. No response. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator inside. Sarah hesitated, then pushed the door open. The air felt heavy, still, thick with something unspoken. Everything in the living room looked perfectly normal, too normal. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the coffee table. A sweater was draped neatly over the couch. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the silence made her heart race. She stepped further in, calling again, "Emma?" Still nothing. It was then that she noticed the faint metallic scent in the air, that sharp, cold smell that made her stomach twist. Something wasn't right. She backed out quickly and called the police. Within minutes, Willow Creek, that quiet, peaceful street, became a crime scene. Detective Laura Bennett was among the first to arrive. A seasoned investigator with years of experience, she had seen her fair share of tragedies. But as she stepped into Emma Hayes' home, something felt different. It wasn't chaos that greeted her, it was calm. The kind of calm that hides something. She looked around, scanning every detail. A book lay open on the table. The cat was hiding beneath the couch, trembling. There were faint smudges near the kitchen doorway, not enough to be obvious, but enough to make her stop and look closer. She'd learned to trust her instincts, and something about this scene whispered that it was carefully arranged. Neighbors began to gather outside. The familiar hum of gossip and concern filled the air, people asking questions, making guesses. But inside, Detective Bennett focused only on what the house itself was trying to say. She believed every crime scene had a language of its own, a story written not in words but in details. The placement of objects, the traces of movement, the things left behind. And as she took her first steps through Emma's hallway, she could already sense that this story wasn't going to be simple. She noted the family photos on the wall, Emma and Daniel smiling on their wedding day, pictures of vacations, moments frozen in happier times. One photo had been taken down, leaving behind a faint square outline on the wallpaper. Why that one? Why was it missing? In the kitchen, a chair was slightly pushed back from the table, just enough to suggest someone had stood up abruptly. The refrigerator door had fingerprints near the handle, smudged as if someone's hands were wet or trembling. On the counter, a ceramic mug sat half full, the coffee now cold, a thin film forming on its surface. Detective Bennett could tell Emma hadn't expected anything unusual that night. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows. Whoever had entered that home had been let in, or had a key. That detail alone changed everything. She made her way down the hall toward the bedroom. The door was partially closed, the light off. For a moment, she hesitated. Something about the silence behind that door felt suffocating. She slowly turned the handle and stepped inside. There she found Emma Hayes. The sight was enough to freeze even the most experienced investigator. Emma lay on the floor near the foot of her bed, her head resting at an unnatural angle. A pool of dried blood had darkened the carpet beneath her. On the nightstand, the alarm clock was shattered, the glass cracked, its hands frozen at 9:17 p.m. That single detail, the stopped clock, struck Detective Bennett immediately. Time had become part of the story. As the rest of the crime scene team entered, flashlights began to sweep across the room. The walls told their own tale, faint marks of movement, a struggle, maybe even panic. But there was something else, something harder to explain. The scene felt deliberate, staged. It wasn't the kind of chaos left behind by chance or rage. It was the kind of scene that had been arranged to look a certain way. And for Bennett, that was the first clue. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the quiet street. The neighborhood that had always felt safe was now the center of something dark and inexplicable. As officers secured the perimeter and began knocking on doors, Detective Bennett took one last look at Emma Hayes' house. From the outside, it looked as peaceful as ever, white siding, blue shutters, the scent of spring flowers drifting from the garden. But inside, it was a different story. A story of trust broken, lives intertwined, and a truth waiting to be uncovered. In Willow Creek, appearances meant everything. But on that night, the illusion shattered, revealing that even the quietest places can hide the loudest secrets. Emma Hayes had lived a life full of kindness and calm. Yet, in the end, it was her home, the place she had once filled with laughter and love, that would tell the final chapter of her story. And as the investigation began, Detective Bennett couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were already there, written in the silence, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be found. It's already speaking through the walls, the objects, the stillness left behind. And that night, in that quiet little house on Willow Creek Drive, the crime scene was already telling its own story. The living room was undisturbed. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. Everything in the small house looked almost too perfect. The television remote sat neatly on the armrest of the couch, the mail stacked in order on the coffee table, and a faint scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. To the untrained eye, nothing seemed amiss, but detectives knew better. Silence, they often said, can be the loudest thing at a crime scene. As they moved through the living room, their footsteps echoed softly against the wooden floorboards. Something felt off, not chaotic, but wrong in a quiet, deliberate way. The stillness carried tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then, one of the officers noticed something out of place, a single dark droplet near the kitchen threshold. It was barely visible under the yellow light, but once they saw it, they saw another, and another. A faint trail of blood, leading toward the narrow hallway. The kitchen told a different story from the living room. Here, the illusion of order began to unravel. A single chair was overturned beside the small round table, and the sound of a refrigerator humming filled the uneasy air. On the counter, an unfinished plate of food sat next to a half-empty mug, its coffee long gone cold. One of the detectives crouched down to examine the floor. The faint pattern of smudges caught his eye. Someone had moved quickly, maybe stumbled. The droplets weren't random. They curved, leading toward the hall like breadcrumbs, deliberate and haunting. When they reached the bedroom, everything changed. It wasn't the sight of violence that froze them. It was the sense of intrusion, the feeling that they had stepped into the final moments of someone's life. Emma Hayes lay on the floor beside her bed, her arm outstretched as though she had tried to reach for something, maybe the phone, maybe the door. Her hair was matted with blood, her expression still frozen in shock. She hadn't expected whoever did this. There were no defensive wounds on her hands, no sign that she even had time to scream. The medical examiner would later confirm what they already suspected: blunt force trauma. The object used was likely heavy and close at hand. But what haunted the detectives wasn't the cause of death, it was the quiet order surrounding it. There was no chaos, no struggle, no desperate attempt to escape. It looked staged, almost too careful. Then they began to notice the details, the clues hidden in plain sight that would shape the story of that night. The clock on the nightstand was shattered, its face cracked clean through the center, the hands frozen at exactly 9:17 p.m. It wasn't just broken, it had been struck. Someone had hit it hard enough to stop time itself. The detectives wrote the time down, knowing that in most cases, broken clocks didn't just happen by accident. Beside the clock, a mug rested on the floor, half filled with coffee that had gone cold and developed a thin, oily film across the top. Emma was a creature of habit. She often made a cup before bed, reading a book before turning in. But this time the cup was by the nightstand, not on her dresser or in the kitchen. Had she carried it in, or had someone brought it for her? Across the room, the window was open just slightly, enough for the curtains to move gently with the night breeze. The scent of rain drifted in. The weather report from that evening had noted light showers around 9 p.m., and the detectives couldn't help but notice the faint muddy streaks on the carpet leading away from the window. The footprints were large, deep enough to suggest a man's weight, and clearly defined. They led not toward the door, but toward the hallway where the blood trail began. The prints told a sequence of movement: step, drag, turn. Whoever had been there had tried to leave, but had doubled back for some reason. The direction of the footprints and the blood spatter suggested a moment of hesitation, a pause in panic. One detective quietly said what everyone was thinking: whoever did this knew Emma. There was no sign of forced entry, no pried windows or broken locks. She had let them in. But the story the scene told didn't end there. They found Emma's phone on the dresser, face down. The screen was cracked, but the power light still glowed faintly. A text message was open, unfinished. It read, "You can't keep showing up like this. We're done." The timestamp was 9:13 p.m. That placed the sender, Emma, alive just 4 minutes before the clock stopped. That message changed everything. Detectives pulled Daniel Hayes' records immediately. He had called Emma 3 times that evening, all within a 10-minute span. He told them later that he was checking in, that they had argued earlier in the week about money, but he hadn't seen her that night. His tone was calm when questioned, but his answers came too easily, as if he'd practiced them. The problem was, everything in that room pointed toward a man: the footprints, the size of the handprint smudged faintly on the window frame, the coffee mug that bore faint traces of aftershave scent. But what made the scene so strange wasn't just what was there, it was what was missing. There was no weapon. No blunt object in the room that could have caused the kind of injury Emma sustained. No baseball bat, no heavy vase, nothing. Whoever had attacked her had taken it with them. That suggested thought, intent, not an act of rage, but a plan. And yet there were contradictions. The way the mug had been placed near the bed, too casual. The shattered clock, too symbolic. One detective, a veteran of 20 years, murmured that it felt like a message. "Someone wanted us to see something," he said quietly, staring at the frozen hands of the clock. "They wanted us to know the time." That phrase would come to haunt them later. The rest of the house remained untouched. Her purse was still on the kitchen counter. Her jewelry was in its usual place. The laptop, still open on the table, blinked with a half-finished email draft. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random. Whoever came there that night came for her and her alone. The medical examiner confirmed that the fatal blow had been delivered from behind, a sudden strike with enough force to cause immediate unconsciousness. There were no signs of a second strike, meaning it had happened quickly, perhaps impulsively. But what stood out was that after the initial blow, the assailant had moved her body slightly, just enough to cover part of the carpet stain beneath her head. That action spoke volumes. It meant the killer wasn't detached. They had felt something: guilt, remorse, panic. It wasn't cold-blooded. It was personal. As detectives combed through the scene, one of them noticed a faint indentation on the bedspread, the kind that suggested someone had been sitting there for a while, perhaps waiting. The cup of coffee, the open window, the calm in the room, it all began to paint a picture. Emma knew this person. They'd been talking, maybe arguing, maybe trying to find closure. Then something went wrong, a push, a fall, a moment that spiraled out of control. But if this was spontaneous, how did the footprints get there? Why had the killer bothered to open the window, to stage the time, to remove the weapon? It was almost as if someone had taken those final minutes and rewritten them, shaping the scene into a version of events that would lead investigators in the wrong direction. The muddy prints became the focal point. They were large, heavy, with deep treads, size 11 boots. They were scattered across the bedroom and down the hallway, fading by the kitchen. When they were sent for analysis, the results came back fast. Daniel Hayes wore the exact same size. Detectives brought him in for questioning the next day. Daniel looked tired, worn, his voice flat. He said he hadn't been near Emma's house in days. He had an alibi, a coworker who claimed they were together at a bar until after 10. But security cameras in the area told a different story. Daniel's car had been seen driving past Emma Street at 9:12 p.m. just minutes before her clock stopped. He explained it away easily. "I was just driving by. I thought about stopping, but I didn't." He smiled when he said it, but the detectives didn't miss the tremor in his hands. What they didn't tell him was that the crime scene had already begun revealing contradictions, signs of another presence, faint traces of a different shoe print beneath the muddy ones, almost invisible unless the light hit at the right angle. It was smaller, narrower, a woman's footprint, likely barefoot. But for now, all the evidence pointed toward Daniel. His size, his car, his history. The message on Emma's phone seemed like the final proof she was cutting him off. He had motive, opportunity, and a connection that ran deep. Still, one detective couldn't shake the feeling that the story was too neat. Real crime scenes were messy, emotional, chaotic. This one was deliberate, almost theatrical. It was as if the killer had written a script, and Daniel was cast as the villain. As they packed up the evidence that night, the rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the window pane that had been left open. The room was silent, but in that silence there was a weight, a whisper that no one could hear but everyone could feel. The detective turned once more toward the broken clock on the nightstand, its hands frozen forever at 9:17. Time had stopped for Emma Hayes. But for those investigating, time had just started moving toward a truth far more complicated than anyone imagined. And as the case would later reveal, those muddy footprints didn't just belong to a killer trying to hide. They belonged to a story, one written in panic, betrayal, and quiet desperation. A story that only the crime scene itself could tell. They belonged to a man's boots, size 11, the same size Daniel Hayes wore. When detectives questioned Daniel Hayes, his demeanor was calm, eerily calm. His voice was steady, his hands rested neatly on the table, and his eyes met every question with a kind of quiet confidence that made the room colder. He claimed he hadn't seen Emma in over a week, that their last conversation was a brief exchange about signing some final divorce papers. He said he had moved out, that he had no reason to return, and that he was trying to move on with his life. But there was something in his story that didn't fit. The words came too easily, as if they had been practiced. Every detective in that room had seen this before, the kind of calm that comes not from innocence, but from control. Yet, for all the tension hanging in that airless interrogation room, they had no real evidence to hold him. His neighbor saw his car parked in the driveway that evening. Nothing screamed guilt. Nothing except a feeling. Detective Laura Simmons, the lead investigator on the case, couldn't shake that feeling. She had spent 15 years in homicide, and she'd learned that every case has a heartbeat, one small detail that keeps it alive, whispering to you even when the facts don't line up. For Emma's case, that heartbeat was the clock on the nightstand, frozen at 9:17 p.m. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a timestamp, a silent witness to the moment something terrible happened. Days later, a new piece of information arrived. Security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera showed Daniel's car driving past Emma's house at exactly 9:12 p.m., 5 minutes before that clock stopped ticking. The grainy footage wasn't crystal clear, but the license plate matched, and the headlights illuminated the house number as the car slowed near Emma's driveway. Daniel had no explanation. He claimed he had driven by to clear his head, that his route home often passed that street. But no one believed that a man trying to move on from his ex-wife would clear his head by driving past her house in the dark. Still, suspicion wasn't evidence. There were no fingerprints at the scene, no weapon found, no eyewitnesses. The case felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. The crime scene told a story, but parts of it were missing, like pages torn from a book. Detective Simmons and her team spent nights re-examining the photos, combing through the evidence logs, looking for something, anything, they had missed. The carpet fibers under Emma's body didn't match the rest of the room. Someone had moved her after she fell. The coffee mug found near her bed had her fingerprints, but also faint smudges of another person's touch. The prints were partial, incomplete, and too blurred to make a match. Every small clue seemed to pull them toward Daniel, but there was no smoking gun. The district attorney refused to file charges without something solid. Weeks turned into months. The case was close to going cold. But then came the turning point, a clue so small it was almost invisible. One afternoon, while reviewing the scene photos for the 100th time, Detective Simmons noticed something odd in the background of a shot. It was a faint mark on the living room wall, just above waist height. At first it looked like a smudge, the kind of imperfection you'd ignore. But to a detective's eye, it was the kind of detail that tugged at the edges of reason. She called for a forensic team to revisit the house. When they arrived, the air inside still smelled faintly of the cleaning chemicals from the initial sweep. The living room was undisturbed, the couch cushions still neatly aligned, the bookshelf undusted since the night of the murder. Simmons walked to the wall, running her gloved hand over the faint streak. It was slightly sticky to the touch. Someone had brushed past the spot, possibly while carrying something heavy, something that left behind an invisible trace. Forensics ran a luminol test. Under the soft, eerie glow of the chemical reaction, the room transformed. The clean white paint burst into ghostly blue patches of light, and then they saw it, just beneath the streak, what looked like the outline of a partial handprint. Not clear, but there. Hidden beneath layers of paint and wiped surfaces, as if someone had tried to erase it but failed. The lab confirmed it wasn't Daniel's. When the results came back, the entire department went silent. The partial handprint belonged to someone who had never even been a suspect, Maya Torres, Emma's best friend. The revelation didn't make sense at first. Maya had been one of the first people to speak to the police. She had been distraught, sobbing through her interviews, saying Emma was like a sister to her. She had organized candlelight vigils, spoken to the press, and even helped clean out Emma's classroom after her death. Everyone trusted her. Everyone pitied her. Detective Simmons requested Maya's phone records, hoping for clarity. What she found instead was a web of late-night messages between Maya and Daniel. Dozens of texts exchanged over the weeks leading up to the murder. Many were harmless at first, conversations about Emma's emotional state, about how Daniel was handling the separation. But slowly, the tone shifted. There were messages about regrets, about things that went too far, about secrets that could destroy everything. Then, on the night of the murder, 20 messages exchanged in less than an hour. And then, nothing. All deleted. Simmons stared at the timeline. 8:45 p.m., first message. 9:12 p.m., Daniel's car on camera. 9:17 p.m., Emma's clock stops. 9:17 p.m., Maya's phone goes dark. The story was beginning to tell itself. When they brought Maya in for questioning, her composure cracked almost instantly. Her voice trembled. Her fingers twisted in her lap. She claimed she had gone to Emma's house that evening to drop off some of her belongings, a scarf, some books, things she had borrowed. She said Emma wasn't home, that she left them on the porch and drove away. But when detectives showed her a photo of her handprint glowing faintly blue on Emma's wall, the room went still. Maya froze. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Then quietly she whispered, "That can't be right." The detectives leaned in, waiting. Silence. Then a tear slid down her cheek. "We didn't mean for it to happen," she said. The confession unraveled in fragments, each word breaking the illusion of friendship and trust that had surrounded Emma's life. Maya and Daniel had been having an affair for months, carefully hidden behind the mask of concern. What began as emotional support turned into something darker, a secret relationship born from shared guilt and loneliness. Emma had found out. She had confronted Maya days before her death, demanding that she end it, threatening to expose everything. On the night of the murder, Maya went to Emma's house to beg her not to tell Daniel's employer he was a local contractor with a spotless reputation, and the scandal would have ruined him. The argument turned violent. Emma shoved her, Maya pushed back, and Emma fell, hitting her head on the corner of the dresser. Maya panicked. She tried to wake her, shaking her, crying her name, but Emma was gone. In those desperate moments, fear took over reason. Maya dragged the body to the bedroom, trying to make it look like Daniel had done it. She smashed the clock to set a false time. She poured coffee into a mug to stage a late-night visit. She even opened the window to make it seem like someone had fled. She wiped her fingerprints from everything she could touch, everything but that one spot on the wall, where she had steadied herself while carrying Emma's body. When Daniel drove by that night, it wasn't coincidence. Maya had texted him, telling him she needed to talk. He never got out of the car. He never went inside. But in the eyes of the world, his car's headlights had already written his guilt. As Maya's confession filled the room, the detectives listened in stunned silence. The truth was worse than they'd imagined, not a crime of hate, but a crime of fear and betrayal. When the case went to trial, the courtroom was packed. The story had captivated the small town that once thought itself immune to tragedy. Maya sat in the defendant's chair, pale and trembling, her hands clasped tightly as if praying for the past to change. Daniel testified, his voice hollow. He spoke of guilt he didn't deserve, of love he wished he could forget. The prosecution presented the evidence, the phone records, the camera footage, the confession, the partial handprint glowing blue under the lab lights. Piece by piece, the story rebuilt itself, the same way the detectives had seen it, a crime scene speaking through the silence. When the verdict came down, guilty of second-degree murder, Maya didn't cry. She only whispered one thing before the bailiff led her away. "She was my best friend." Detective Simmons never forgot those words. In her final report, she wrote, "The crime scene told its own story. Every detail, every mark, every silence spoke louder than the lies that tried to cover it. The truth was always there. It just needed someone to listen." Emma's house was later sold, but neighbors say it still feels heavy, as if the walls remember. And perhaps they do. Because the night Emma Hayes lost her life, her home didn't just hold the evidence, it became the storyteller. The scene had seen everything. It had witnessed love, betrayal, fear, and guilt. It remembered the sound of a shattered clock, the whisper of an apology too late to be heard, the soft echo of footsteps leaving through an open window. It remembered the truth. And in the end, when words failed, it was the scene itself that spoke for her. Because a crime scene never lies. It listens, it remembers, and when the time comes, it tells its own story. Maya Torres had always been a fixture in Emma Hayes' life. To the outside world, they were inseparable, the kind of friends who finished each other's sentences and shared every secret. Maya was there through Emma's heartbreak, her divorce, and the slow rebuilding of her life afterward. When people saw them together, they saw loyalty, comfort, and sisterhood. But beneath that easy laughter and late-night coffee talks, something darker was brewing. Something Emma had only begun to sense in the days before her death. During the investigation, Maya told detectives that she had been helping Emma move on, that she was checking on her that week because Emma had been struggling emotionally. Her tone was calm, almost rehearsed, as she repeated her version of the story, that she hadn't spoken to Daniel in months, that she was home that evening watching a movie, that she only learned about Emma's death the following morning through a friend's message. At first, her account sounded believable. There were no glaring inconsistencies. She knew the right details to include, the right emotions to show. Tears came at the perfect moments. But as every seasoned investigator knows, truth and performance rarely share the same heartbeat. Detective Laura Grant, one of the lead investigators, wasn't convinced. Something about Maya's version felt too clean, too convenient. While others focused on Daniel, the ex-husband with the obvious motive, Laura decided to look deeper into Maya's story. It wasn't intuition alone. There were small things that didn't add up. Maya claimed she had called Emma that evening around 7 p.m., yet Emma's phone records showed no incoming call. She said she'd gone to bed by 10 o'clock, yet her phone had been active on messaging apps past midnight. It was subtle, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt. When the detectives obtained phone records through a warrant, that seed began to grow into something undeniable. Over the course of 3 weeks leading up to the murder, Maya and Daniel had exchanged hundreds of text messages. They weren't all incriminating, but the frequency told a story, one of secret meetings, private frustrations, and an emotional connection that went beyond friendship. The night Emma died, the two exchanged 23 messages between 8 o'clock and 9:30 p.m., the very window in which the attack occurred. And by 10:15, those same messages had been deleted from both of their phones. But digital traces have a way of surviving even the most careful attempts at erasure. Fragments of those texts were recovered. The messages were brief but suggestive. Daniel had written, "She knows something. We need to talk." Maya replied, "I'll handle it." A few minutes later came another from Daniel, "Don't do anything stupid." Those 5 words, "Don't do anything stupid," would later echo through the courtroom like a haunting refrain. But the real discovery came not from the phones, but from Emma's laptop. Hidden deep in her drafts folder, detectives found an unsent email addressed to Daniel. It was short, almost abrupt, as though she had written it in haste or fear. It read, "I know what you and Maya have been hiding. I'm done pretending I don't see it. We'll talk tonight." Those words hit the investigation like a thunderclap. Emma had found out about them, about the affair. And not only that, she had planned to confront Daniel that same night. That revelation shifted everything. Daniel's car had indeed been seen near Emma's home at 9:12 p.m., but when he was questioned again, he admitted to driving by her street, claiming he wanted to talk but lost his nerve. Detectives now believe that Emma had reached out to Maya before confronting Daniel, and that Maya, feeling trapped, decided to get to Emma first. Piece by piece, the crime scene began to unravel its own truth. Every detail that once seemed random began to speak. The open window at the back of the house, initially thought to be the killer's escape route, was discovered to have been opened from the inside. The muddy footprints leading toward it? They didn't match Daniel's stride. In fact, the spacing between each print was shorter, lighter, consistent with a smaller frame. The pattern of the mud also suggested it was brought into the house, not tracked out. And then, the clock. The clock was the most haunting clue of all. It was found shattered beside Emma's nightstand, frozen at 9:17 p.m. The assumption was that the struggle had caused it to fall and break at the moment of the attack. But when forensics examined it, they discovered that the battery had been removed before the impact. The clock hadn't stopped because of the fall. Someone had deliberately broken it to control the narrative, to set a false timestamp, to align it with Daniel's arrival at 9:12 p.m. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Detective Grant gathered the team and walked them through the sequence, almost like reading a confession written in objects. "The scene isn't random," she said. "It's a message. Someone wanted us to believe this happened while Daniel was there. But the scene was constructed. Every piece was positioned." As she spoke, the evidence laid out on the board seemed to align like puzzle pieces finally snapping into place. The overturned chair in the kitchen was a prop to suggest a struggle. The mug of coffee, still half full, showed that Emma hadn't been expecting danger. She'd been calm, maybe even welcoming, when Maya arrived. And the faint streak of blood on the living room wall, the one they'd nearly missed, contained traces of 2 distinct fingerprints. One was Emma's. The other, confirmed by the lab 2 days later, belonged to Maya Torres. When confronted with that evidence, Maya initially denied everything. She insisted she had visited Emma earlier that day to drop off some of her things that she hadn't returned later that night. But as detectives pressed harder, her story began to splinter. Her eyes darted. Her hands trembled. She asked for water twice. And when Detective Grant quietly placed a photograph of the recovered text messages on the table, the one that read, "I'll handle it," Maya's mask began to crumble. For hours she resisted, but the weight of the evidence grew unbearable. Finally, at 3:47 in the morning, she whispered the words that sealed her fate. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." She confessed that she and Daniel had been seeing each other for months, secretly. What started as comfort during Emma's marital struggles had turned into an affair neither could walk away from. But recently, Daniel had started pulling back. He wanted to end things with Maya. He wanted to try and make peace with his past with Emma. Maya couldn't accept it. She told herself she wasn't losing him, not to Emma, not to anyone. On the night of the murder, after reading a message Emma sent to Daniel, Maya drove to Emma's house. She said she only wanted to talk, to explain, to make her understand that Daniel no longer loved her. Emma let her in. The two sat in the kitchen, voices rising, emotions spilling over. Emma accused her of betrayal, of destroying what was left of her life. Maya's anger ignited. Words became shouting. Shouting turned into pushing. And then, a single moment of blind fury, Emma fell, her head striking the edge of the counter. Maya said the silence that followed felt unreal, like time had frozen. She called Emma's name, shook her, but there was no response. Panic took over. She wanted to erase what had happened, to make it look like something else. She thought of Daniel, of the messages, of the guilt she already carried. So she began to rearrange the room. She staged the scene to frame him, convincing herself that if it looked like his doing, no one would question her. She broke the clock, opened the window, dragged mud in from the garden to mimic his boot prints. She thought she was buying herself time. But in her rush, she made mistakes. Tiny human mistakes. The smudge of her fingerprint on the wall, the misplaced mud pattern, the inconsistencies in her timeline, all the ways a lie eventually starts to contradict itself. The very things she used to build her cover story became the breadcrumbs that led investigators right back to her. In the end, it wasn't a witness or a confession that told the truth, it was the scene itself. Every object, every smear of dirt, every broken fragment whispered the same thing, that Maya had been there, and that the chaos wasn't random, but orchestrated. The story she tried to create was undone by the real story the evidence told. When the case went to trial months later, the prosecution's argument was devastatingly simple. "You don't have to hear the crime to know what happened," the district attorney said. "You just have to look at what it left behind." The jury listened as forensic experts detailed how the scene contradicted Maya's version of events. They showed how the direction of the blood spatter indicated a fall, not a strike from behind, how the clock had been tampered with, how the open window bore no fingerprints except for Maya's own. They even played fragments of the phone data, the tone of desperation in her texts unmistakable. Maya sat still, her hands folded, her eyes down. When the verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder, she didn't cry. She only whispered again, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." After the trial, Detective Grant was asked what she thought solved the case. She didn't mention the fingerprint or the texts. She simply said, "The house told us. We just had to listen." That statement resonated far beyond the courtroom. It became a quiet reminder to every investigator who ever stood over a silent scene. Because sometimes justice isn't shouted, it's whispered through the walls, through the way a chair sits askew, through the details no one thinks to look at twice. And in this case, the crime scene truly did tell its own story. It was the story of jealousy, desperation, and a single irreversible moment that destroyed 3 lives. Emma's, who never got to finish her letter. Daniel's, whose guilt would linger for the rest of his life even though he was innocent. And Maya's, whose attempt to rewrite reality ended up sealing her fate. The house on Willow Creek Drive stands quiet now, its windows empty, its rooms stripped bare. But for those who walk past it, especially on quiet nights when the wind moves through the trees, there's an eerie stillness, as if the walls themselves remember. Some say that's what justice really is. Not vengeance, not punishment, but the simple, unrelenting voice of truth, the voice that refuses to be silenced, no matter how many lies try to bury it. And that night, the truth spoke louder than anyone ever expected. Maya was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Daniel, cleared of suspicion, left town soon after, his name forever linked to a tragedy he didn't commit. Emma Hayes' home still stands on Willow Creek Drive, its windows quiet, its story etched into the walls. The detectives often say they didn't solve the case. The scene did. Because sometimes when no one is left to speak, the truth finds its own voice. This was another story from True Justice Stories. Subscribe for more real tales where truth meets justice.